On the morning of April 16, 1945, a T-34-85 rolled toward the outskirts of Berlin wearing what looked like stolen furniture. Iron bed frames were welded along the turret, wire mesh hung off the hull sides. Bent rods stuck out from the front plate like ribs on a dead animal. To a tank engineer, it looked embarrassing. To a mechanic, it looked dangerous. To the men inside the tank, it looked like the only reason they might live long enough to reach the next street. The extra metal did not make the T-34 thicker. It did not turn 45 millimeters of sloped hull armor into a fortress. It added weight, it snagged on rubble, it made the tank wider in streets already choked with bricks, tram wire, and burned-out trucks. On a factory drawing, it was junk. But Berlin was not a factory drawing. Berlin was a city where German infantry waited in cellars with Panzerfaust tubes across their knees, where a tank could survive an 88 millimeter shell at range, and then die from a man standing 12 meters away behind a broken doorway. That is why Soviet crews began welding cages, bed springs, wire screens, and scrap iron around their tanks. Not because it looked strong, because it attacked the one thing the Panzerfaust needed most: timing. A Panzerfaust was not trying to smash through armor like a hammer. It used a shaped charge. When the warhead detonated, the explosive collapsed a metal liner into a focused jet moving fast enough to cut through steel. But that jet was not magic. It had to form, it had to stretch. It had to arrive at the armor at the right distance and in the right shape. Give it that perfect moment, and a weapon a single infantryman could carry could kill a 30-ton tank. Steal that moment by even a little, and the same warhead could burn itself half wrong before it reached the real armor. That was the idea hiding behind the ugly mesh. The screen did not need to stop the Panzerfaust. It only needed to make the Panzerfaust detonate early. The warhead hit the rods, the fuse fired, the jet began forming in empty air, tangled through bent wire, smoke, and a gap the designers had not planned for. By the time it reached the turret or hull, it might still scar the plate. It might still blind the crew with dust. It might still crack brackets, peel welds, and hammer every man inside with concussion. But sometimes it did not penetrate, and sometimes was enough. This was the part the manuals struggled to explain. The T-34-85 already had respectable armor by the standards of a fast medium tank, a sharply sloped hull, a heavier turret than the early wartime models, and a gun that could threaten German armor at useful combat ranges. That mattered in open country. It mattered far less inside a city. In Berlin, the fight moved from street corners to stairwells, from long-range gunnery to shadows under windowsills. The Panzerfaust did not care that the T-34 had crossed half of Eastern Europe. It did not care that Soviet tank brigades had learned to maneuver through minefields, artillery belts, and anti-tank guns. It waited in an apartment block, one man, one tube, one shot into a side plate while the crew was looking the other way. The normal solution was tactics: infantry clearing buildings, machine guns raking windows, tanks moving fast, never stopping, never presenting a flank. But tactics break down when a city is collapsing around you. Smoke hides windows, dust hides doorways, a dead horse blocks a turn. The lead tank halts for 3 seconds, and 3 seconds is long enough for someone in a basement to raise a Panzerfaust. So crews and repair battalions started adding what they could actually find: bed frames from ruined houses, iron railings pulled from staircases, welded mesh, scrap bars cut and fixed around the turret cheeks and hull sides. The result looked ridiculous. A tank built by a state factory covered in the wreckage of somebody's bedroom. And that is exactly why some officers hated it. The objections were not foolish. The extra frames could tear off. They could trap mud. They could block vision. They could catch on walls in narrow streets. Bad welds could break loose at the worst possible moment, and a screen set at the wrong distance could do almost nothing. A clean firing test could make the whole thing look like superstition. Put a Panzerfaust in the right position. Fire it squarely at a plate. Measure the hole. Under those conditions, scrap iron was easy to dismiss. But a clean test was not what killed tanks in Berlin. A rush shot killed tanks. A bad angle killed tanks. A warhead fired through dust killed tanks. A German teenager leaning out of a cellar window, shaking, half blinded by smoke, trying to hit a moving target before Soviet infantry saw him. That killed tanks. And in that kind of shot, geometry became fragile. A mesh screen could change the fuse point. A few inches of air could stretch the jet before it was ready. An oblique impact could make the charge bite unevenly. A rod could deform the nose. The blast could tear away the cage and still leave the actual hull with only a black crater where the crew expected a funeral. The engineers were asking the wrong question. They asked, does this added metal equal more armor thickness? The crews were asking something else. Does it ruin the enemy's perfect shot? That difference was everything. Because the Panzerfaust was a weapon of perfect geometry delivered under terrible human conditions. It was powerful. It was cheap. It was terrifyingly simple. But it still needed a clean relationship between warhead, distance, angle, and armor. The welded screens attacked that relationship. Not every time, not cleanly, not in a way that made a proud technical diagram, but enough that crews kept demanding them, enough that workshops kept burning rods into place, enough that tanks entered Berlin looking less like machines from a factory, and more like animals grown extra bones. By late April, the Red Army had learned the price of streets. A column could lose its first tank at an intersection, then lose the second while it tried to push around the burning hull. Infantry had to climb floor by floor. Tank commanders had to fight with one eye on the next objective and one eye on every black window above them. The ugliest danger was that armor gave confidence in places where confidence got people killed. A tank in a field feels large. A tank in a city feels trapped. Its gun is too long for alleys. Its turret cannot look straight up. Its engine announces it from blocks away. Its armor is thick where the enemy is not standing, and thin where the enemy has learned to aim. That was the darkest truth behind the bedframe tanks. They were not a clever upgrade from comfort. They were a confession. A confession that the most industrial army on Earth was being forced, street by street, to improvise against men firing disposable tubes from kitchens and stairwells. The Soviet crews did not weld furniture to tanks because they misunderstood armor. They welded it because they understood the battlefield too well. They had seen bare side plates opened like tins. They had seen turret crews climb out burning. They had seen a tank make it through artillery, mines, and anti-tank guns, only to be killed by a weapon cheap enough to hand to a schoolboy. So when a tank came back with a screen torn open but the crew alive, nobody needed a lecture. They looked at the scorch mark. They looked at the missing rods. They looked at the men still breathing inside. That was not theory. That was a result. And results mattered more than elegance. The screen armor also did something the reports rarely measured. It changed the behavior of the men inside the tank. A crew that believed every window was instant death moved one way. A crew that believed it had even a small chance against a hurried Panzerfaust shot moved differently, not recklessly, not safely, but with enough steadiness to keep pushing. And in urban combat, steadiness is not emotional decoration. It is a tactical resource. A driver who does not freeze keeps the hull angled. A commander who stays exposed for one more second can spot the next doorway. A gunner who trusts the tank just enough can traverse toward movement instead of ducking blind. The extra iron did not only interfere with the warhead, it interfered with fear. That is why the modifications survived criticism. The metal was crude, the welds were ugly, the science was incomplete, but the battlefield feedback was immediate. Bare tanks died in ways everyone could see. Screen tanks still died, but sometimes they came home with the cage peeled back and the armor behind it scarred instead of pierced. There was no perfect lesson in that, only a practical one. Armor is not always a wall. Sometimes armor is a delay. Sometimes it is a gap. Sometimes it is a bad angle forced onto a good weapon. Sometimes it is a few inches of empty space placed exactly where the enemy expected certainty. That is what the bed frames really were, not extra steel, extra time. A Panzerfaust needed a fraction of a moment to become lethal. The screen tried to spend that moment early, before the jet was clean, before the armor was touched, before the crew's lives depended on one perfect point of copper and fire. On paper, that looked like nonsense. In Berlin, it looked like a tank rolling out of a side street with its cage half ripped away and 5 men still inside. The most important armor on that T-34 was not the factory plate. It was the lesson welded over it. The men in design offices measured thickness. The men in the tank measured survival. And the difference between those two measurements was the entire war compressed into one ugly cage of scrap iron. The steel did not stop the warhead. It stole its timing. And in Berlin, timing was sometimes the only armor left.